Good evening. Thank you very much to Alice Cuddy for that generous introduction. I want to thank Rashida Phillips, who spent a lot of time arranging the particulars and details of my being here, to all the staff who work hard for the Chicago Humanities Festival. Having run a cultural institution, I recognize how important that work is in making everything possible. I am home. I am incredibly happy to be here. I was literally nearly born around the corner. My mother is here in the second row. Yes, very proud mother. So just on Oglesby at 69th and Oglesby, I lived the first 3 years of my life and went to Toddler's Inn, nursery school. So this is terrific, and I've never had the chance to speak here at the South Shore Country Club. There are a few other folks in the audience. My closest aunt, Ella Muhammad, is here. I have other relatives, Elijah Muhammad, and so many others. I have my oldest friend from childhood, Ben Austin. I have colleagues, both in terms of academia as well as the work that I do now from Cure Violence. I have to give a special shout out to my high school history teacher, Bonnie Carter from Kenwood Academy, who is here. I haven't seen, I guess, Miss Carter since I left high school. And I joked with her that I happened to take the AP US History exam, of which she was my AP US History teacher. I did get college credit. I scored a 4. And the essay question was on Booker T and Du Bois, their great debate. So high school matters, let me just say that, in terms of the work that many of us will one day do. So there are many, many more people here, and some of you have already said hello to, but I'm very honored that you've come out tonight. So let me begin with a joke, because this is about as light as it's going to get. So you may have heard this one. A cruise ship was about to sink. The white people looked amongst themselves for someone to pray, but no one wanted to, as everyone was nervous. With tears in his eyes, the ship captain suddenly spotted one of the black custodians. He pointed his finger and shouted, "You, pray for us!" Afraid she would be punished for not listening, the woman agreed and started her prayer with confidence. "Lord, as I was boarding this ship, it said, 'Whites only.' When I wanted to use the bathroom sign, it said, 'Whites only.' When I went to the tables for dinner, it said, 'Whites only.' So Lord, as this ship is about to sink, I pray that you take whites only. Amen." That joke is courtesy of a Russian bot on Facebook. Now, in light of everything that's going on in this country, it is, to my mind, as Yogi Berra once said, deja vu all over again. And in that spirit, let me open with a kind of survey of the state of things, some of which will be familiar, others of which may be new. And so we've got this dance here. This comes from a Brookings report released just last week, where the researchers saw something that they didn't expect to find, although for so many of you who've been educators for many years probably recognize these. So this slide essentially shows the flatness of desegregation efforts over the past 25 years. It's broken out by various groups, showing which groups are more integrated versus which groups are more separate. So the lower the line, the closer to integration, the higher the line, the further away. And in that sense, we see that Asians and whites are more integrated in K through 12 schools as compared to the highest between Asians and blacks. The point here is not to get caught in the details, but a sense to get a spirit of what a generation has looked like with regard to so much work and effort in the aftermath of the great legacies of the civil rights movement. One takeaway, next slide, is, of course, that not much has changed. Here, again, Brookings found that College going, in the spirit of diversity and inclusion and belonging, some really key terms that people turn to today to talk about the initiatives on various campuses for improving the climate of this country writ large, it seems that overall, college going is a more integrated space. So all of those lines are further down between 0 and 100. Again, closer to 0, the more integrated. Nevertheless, you can see there are some distinctions with Asians and blacks being furthest apart in terms of their integration, with Asians and Hispanics being closest in college. I use this because what may be less familiar to you is that in about 30 states right now, it is possible to secede, to break away from existing public school systems. These laws have gone on the books since about 2000, and at least 71 communities, according to reporting by Nikole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times Magazine, these communities have attempted, they're mostly white and wealthy, to break away from their public school districts. Next slide. In the most recent example that she writes about at length here is Gardendale High School in Alabama, part of Jefferson County, which covers the area roughly of Birmingham, Alabama, of course, ground zero for so much of what we think about, where our mind's eye go when we think about civil rights. It turns out that in this county, the Jefferson County is the county basis, a county that is still under a Brown versus Board desegregation decree. It is still being governed by monitors in the Department of Justice with regard to how it apportions demographics of its schooling. They recently built a brand new school, and that brand new school happened to be in Gardendale. And the voters of Gardendale took advantage of that opportunity to say, with this brand new high school that covers multiple municipalities within the county structure, we want to break away. They currently had about 25% of a black population, but they felt that the other districts within that community were bringing in the wrong element into this county-based high school, and therefore thought they'd simply take the school with them. And in the words of Nikole Hannah-Jones, she says, secession supporters had argued that their tax dollars should go to educate their own children instead of children who lived outside their community, that their shared responsibility stretched no further than the arbitrary borders of their town, even though for the vast history of the state, black taxpayers paid for white schools that their own children could not attend. The activists did not acknowledge that the public schools in Gardendale did not belong to Gardendale. They are paid for by the tax dollars of the entire county, including the black parents of children bused in. And so in the end, the decision by a federal judge was to allow Gardendale to break away with 2 elementary schools, which are now independent of the county, but that if they wanted the high school, they'd have to pay $33 million to take that with them too. And so what does this tell us, putting a story inside of those broader demographics about where we've come over the past 25 years? Next slide. You might recognize in the history of criminal justice that in a recent case, the use of predictive analytics to make certain sentencing claims about whether or not a person will be a future offender came down to a decision in a Dwayne Buck case, which was the case of a man convicted of homicide, of killing a girlfriend and an ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend. His guilt was not in dispute, but in the sentencing phase, whether or not he would face the death penalty, it turned out that in a bizarre twist of his defense counsel, an expert witness, a psychologist, testified that given Dwayne Buck's race, there was a statistical likelihood that Dwayne Buck would reoffend. And as such, as one could imagine, the judge therefore sentenced a death sentence. His case eventually, after multiple rounds, went to the Supreme Court based on the work of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to challenge that. Now, This may not be a perfect analog to the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, also set in Monroe, Alabama, at a time in the heart of the Jim Crow period, where the simple allegation of a crime against a black man could end up with either a lynch mob or death sentence. But the notion that somehow over time, in the post-civil rights context, that we've gotten smarter and that our moral compass has gotten sharper suggests that, in fact, just the opposite has happened, that we've found new tools to do the same work. And so this is both an instance, a way of checking the thermometer of where we are in this country at this moment. This decision, this victory was just last year, but also reminding us that if we're not vigilant about such gains, we find ourselves repeating the same mistakes in the past. I sat on a panel with the lead attorney here, Christina Swarns, and happened to attend a recent gala for LDF with Cheryl and Eiffel. And these are fierce women doing battle at a time when, and I want to quote Cheryl and Eiffel here, this was just a week and a half ago. She said, "This is not a moment to focus on resisting the effort to push things back in the way that we know Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, as well as the President himself, are calling for. No, this is not a time to hold the line," she said. "I'm only interested in moving forward." But part of the process of moving forward is also recognizing exactly the stakes that we're up against in a particular civil rights or new civil rights moment. Some of you may know, of course, that the response to Black Lives Matter protests here in Chicago, as well as in Ferguson, going on in St. Louis as we speak, was met with, in the new administration, an initiative for Blue Lives Matter laws. And about 30 states have state legislatures that have considered such laws. A few have passed thus far, in Louisiana in particular, as you can imagine, for a place where both killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge and then the assassination of two police officers, the very difficult context in which that is occurring, breathed life into these laws. But this tells us a lot about the state of play with regard to the push and pull between what we might imagine justice looks like, but also the difficulty of recognizing what activism looks like, the messiness of activism, that it somehow doesn't always line up with what we imagine the moral exemplars of justice should be doing. Next slide. I also want to, of course, remind you that these issues hit very close to home, and everyone in this room is, to my assumption, very well aware of the Justice Department's consent or investigation leading to a consent here in Chicago. Their findings, and I quote, that the Chicago Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of force in violation of the Constitution is based on a comprehensive investigation of force practices and a close analysis of hundreds of individual force incidents. The pattern of unlawful force we found resulted from a collection of poor police practices, tactically unsound and unnecessary foot pursuits, and that these foot pursuits too often end with officers unreasonably shooting someone, including unarmed individuals. Laquan McDonald, of course, was the lightning rod and catalyst for this investigation. Our investigation, they continued, also found that CPD has tolerated racially discriminatory conduct that not only undermines police legitimacy, but also contributes to the pattern of unreasonable force. And so, have we really moved any further, or have we moved backwards? I think is one way to consider as we reflect on civil rights. It's the full gamut, I would argue here, that represents the challenges that are in front of us. So we also recognize that voting rights in the Shelby v. Holder decision removed the enforcement provision that allowed for any changes to legislative districts to be approved by the Department of Justice, particularly in the former Confederate states. That has not only led to voter suppression laws and new ID laws and by some estimates, significant impact on the 2016 election, but also facing in the 2018 election a new round of gerrymandering that already in the state of Texas was ruled by a federal district court as intentional discrimination. And yet, the Supreme Court recently blocked 2 rulings in that case, allowing for those racially gerrymandered districts to go forward. Next slide. And here, as we continue the catalog of horrors that we faced in 2016 and 17, this comes as a result of a collaboration between the news station NPR, National Public Radio, and the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. This represents the first of a series of surveys, of large-scale surveys of individual perceptions and reflections or lived experiences of discrimination. And what we see here are self-reported examples. And it's important to note the authors of this study wanted to be very clear that the questions being asked here are not those who perceive whether Black people experience discrimination in applying for jobs, or in whether they are being promoted or paid fairly, or in their encounters with the police. The questions being asked are, have you experienced discrimination? And for them, methodologically, this is an important intervention in a larger battery of polling data about perception and attitudes, because often what people perceive don't necessarily square with the reality. What they're trying to get to is, can you say on the record that you have experienced discrimination? Why does this matter? It matters because one of the contributors to this work, Professor David Williams of Public Health, says, we have high-quality scientific information that discrimination is prevalent in society. That seems like a no-brainer, but good for a scientist to be careful in language. Large racial disparities exist in health. Over 200 African Americans die every day because they don't have access to the same medical resources as their white counterparts. At every level, there is a racial gap in health. The gaps are larger at the top of the income hierarchy than at the bottom. Now they have research that confirms this as well from South Africa, from Australia and New Zealand, where racial disparities are also matched. And ultimately, discrimination for them, for these public health officials, is an independent predictor of premature mortality. This is not just about people experiencing a bad day in the battery of these experiences described here. This is about the stress that ultimately is a pathogen in their lives. Next slide. So, of course, the big question of our economy and the relationship of whether or not people actually have jobs, to what degree those jobs should have been a panacea for solving some of the intractable problems of racial discrimination and inequality across every sector of American life, attending to the civil rights movement. It turns out just about 2 weeks ago, one of my colleagues, Diva Pager, at Harvard University, someone you might know from her work. So just before we entered the land of make-believe, in 2007, Diva Pager showed in several audit studies. Now, what are audit studies? Audit studies, this is when you send out hundreds of identical resumes of candidates for low-wage, entry-level jobs, except one candidate is named, hypothetically, Jamal Shabazz, and the other is Jim White. And what you find, or what she found, is that sending out Jamal and Jim's resumes, which were perfectly identical, except in 2 instances. Jamal did not check the box that he had a criminal record, and Jim did. And it turned out that Jim was much more likely in the city she audited to get a job in spite of the fact that Jamal did not have a criminal record. So this is the kind of work that Diva Pager does, and she's been doing it for a long time. So she did a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when you take the published work, peer-reviewed work of many, many different researchers and scholars. So she looked at this over 25 years with a team of researchers whose bylines are shared here. And what they found, as the headline reads, is that discrimination in hiring has not improved, that the job ceiling remains. It says, broadly, our meta-analysis of callback rates from all existing field experiments showed evidence of discrimination against Black and Latino applicants. Since 1990, white applicants received on average 36% more callbacks than Black applicants and 25% more callbacks than Latino applicants with identical records. In some ways, we shouldn't entirely be surprised across every field that we've just looked at, the outcome of the 2016 election. To some degree, the one area of which so many of these areas in American life that had not been touched was, of course, in the office of the highest land. As Ta-Nehisi Coates has written, both in The Atlantic and a newly published book, that it's nearly impossible to explain the election of Donald Trump, a person perfectly unqualified for most forms of employment in this country, except the kind of work that you get to do as a business person when you're your own boss. I mean, that's something we see consistent in the American economy. But in this case, his basic argument, Coates' argument, and I agree with him, is that the fact of Trump's election is a backlash against the election of a Black president. But before we move on, let me share one more thing with you. Next slide. So this is kind of a shout out to Chicago. Chicago is an incredibly important place, not least of which, of course, it produced the first Black president and an amazing Black mayor, Harold Washington. But it has had a long tradition of a kind of intelligentsia that helped to shape larger narratives about Black life in this country. It is home to the University of Chicago's sociology department, the first sociology department that helped to engineer ways, even to this day, that we think about social environments, when we think about the relationship of geography to social outcomes. Such words in social science like concentrated poverty and neighborhood disadvantage are words that in some ways grow out of the early work of the Chicago School of Sociology. And some of its most important thinkers were some of the earliest Black sociologists in this country, people like Charles S. Johnson, whose name is unfamiliar to many, but Charles S. Johnson led the first Ferguson or Chicago DOJ report. It was called The Negro in Chicago, published in 1922. It was a study really to unpack the great race pogrom that took place not too far from where we are, when a Black child was stoned to death when he crossed an aqueous color line in Lake Michigan, I believe at Rainbow Beach. And when Black citizens approached the police there, and I see a lot of head shaking, so this is an origin story for Chicago. Everyone knows this story, but it's important to remember it because it set in motion so many other things. When they appealed to law enforcement to be fair and just, to seek an arrest for the whites who had done this, instead they were rebuffed and turned away. And that set in motion their own anger, but that anger was not to attack the white community. The anger was to call in a demand for justice, which was then met by resistance and backlash. Many people died, about 60 people died, 500 or so were arrested, the vast majority of whom were Black. But the Negro in Chicago, that first what I will call Blue Ribbon Commission report, taught us some things about the nature of this American life, taught us about the relationship between law enforcement as the first response of the state to the challenges of a set of social concerns and conditions that for many other groups by that time, whether they were Poles or Slavs or Russians or Jews or Italians or Irish, had no longer been the primary focus of law enforcement, but instead a very robust collaboration of social workers and civil reformers. And I've talked about that many times before. But what I wanted to share with you is out of that tradition, from Charles Johnson to E. Franklin Frazier, came a massive study called Black Metropolis, a study of an urban northern city by Horace Caton and St. Clair Drake. I see more heads shaking. And in this massive work, running to about 750 pages in its first edition, published in 1945, about the same time that Gunnar Myrdal's American Dilemma was published, they did a full taxonomy of the relationship of Black life, the incredible diversity of expressions of experience, of political ideologies, of ways of protest and resisting what we would call anti-racism. They talked about the desire for participating in World War II to not only prove their valor and patriotism, but also to make the world a better place. It wasn't just about what would come of it for them, but it was also a true belief in a world where fascism could live and thrive abroad would also mean that racism would live and thrive in America. But they were also deeply disappointed by the results of a follow-up, a postscript, in 1969. And here you see the postscript. And so in the postscript, what they describe next is, by 1960, it was almost impossible to find any leading or responsible citizen who would defend discrimination on the basis of race or creed. Discrimination is irrational. The problem should be redefined in individual terms. But what they were responding to was the evidence of a job ceiling. They noted here that essentially the vast majority of Black people were trapped at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, where you see in 1940, when they were doing the original work, Black males represented about 71% of the low-wage end of the labor market, and for Black women, about 85% of the low-wage. And you can see the comparisons with their white counterparts. And just again, not to get bogged down too much in the details, not much changed by 1950. And so what they were saying in this postscript in 1969 sounds a lot familiar to us in terms of that 25-year window from when this work was begun in 1944 and 1945 were written, and then 1965. These 25-year cycles become signposts in a way for the ever-changing saying. Next slide. So many of you have read or are familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, or Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Here, Ta-Nehisi Coates is riffing on the disconnect between the history of what Ira Katz-Nelson, the historian and political scientist, calls white affirmative action. It's this series of New Deal laws and policies, and from the establishment of Social Security, which left out about 75% of the Black laboring class, either as domestics or farm workers, to non-discrimination clauses in the distribution of public aid across the South to farmers or urban workers, meaning that without penalties for active discrimination, Black people would simply not get those opportunities, leading to housing policies, first in the Homeowners Loan Corporation, later in the FHA, and eventually to the GI Bill. This omnibus package of roughly, one could argue, half a century of investment in working class white Americans, some of whom had once been Italian or Irish or Polish, but now were just hard-working Americans. Coates is talking about that, but a society that protects some people through a safety net of schools, government-backed home loans, and ancestral wealth, but can protect you only with the club of criminal justice, has either failed at enforcing its good intentions or succeeded at something darker. So those who believe in justice are drawn to Coates when he tells them that America was born of plunder and looting, that Black people have been the bedding of the blanket that covers their eyes from the truth of this country. In the opening pages of Between the World and Me, he writes specifically as he describes this encounter with an interviewer on television, a host. He says, "Wish to know why I felt that white America's progress, or rather the progress of those Americans who believe that they are white, was built on looting and violence. I mean, after all, if it's always getting better, how could he be so depressed, so cynical?" Hearing this, I felt, he writes, an old and indistinct sadness well up in me. The answer to this question is the record of the believers themselves. The answer is American history. There is nothing extreme in this statement. Americans deify democracy in a way that allows for a dim awareness that they have from time to time stood in defiance of their God. For this, Coates was widely recognized for his powerful writing in the moment of Black Lives Matter. He won the National Book Award and an award for being a MacArthur genius. But these truths of which he wrote sprang from deep wells. Let me remind you, his fiery words flowed from the same traditions of Jeremiah's that animated Frederick Douglass's words on the 4th of July in 1852. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. It's hard to imagine that President Trump was thinking about Frederick Douglass last February as another great American hero. I'm pretty sure he doesn't know much about Mr. Douglass's beliefs about this country, because they certainly align very much with the kinds of criticisms that he's insisting, the kinds of dissent that's happening on streets of America today, not be tolerated. So the span of a century and a half of Jeremiah's and protest literature have not solved the recurring belief in the end. The belief, this is, after all, a festival about beliefs. The belief in the cheapness, expendability, and the commodification of Black life. Coates's muse, James Baldwin, points out in 1955 something we might learn from today. Baldwin said, as long as such books are being published, such protest books, an American liberal once said to me, everything will be all right. But Baldwin actually saw this as precisely part of the problem. The literature served less to stir the white liberal reader to action. He said, this report from the pit reassures us, this ecumenical us, of its reality and its darkness, Baldwin wrote, and of our salvation. This was Baldwin's way of saying how white readers essentially believe what Trump articulated, that, quote, blacks are really living in hell. And because they aren't, the distance between those two realities has not been served as an opportunity to bridge those gaps, but somehow to look on in dismay, to read with affect and concern, but to do little more. This is a powerful insight and one worth sitting with for a moment. I learned recently that Derek Black, next slide, the son of Don Black, the creator of Stormfront, which is the largest white nationalist site in the country, 300,000 strong in terms of its members. He visited the Harvard Kennedy School recently to discuss his past. Derek Black is now a student at the University of Chicago studying medieval history. And he tells the story in the Washington Post and elsewhere, and certainly in public. He tells the story of ultimately being in college and bringing his white nationalist views, which the only difference between white nationalists and white supremacist views are that white supremacists believe they are supreme. White nationalists think that East Asians are the most supreme people. But both groups are sure that black people are inferior, just in case you were wondering. So he talks about being in college and ultimately encountering counterclaims, evidence that challenged his views. And that was his conversion process. He talked about getting to know Jewish friends over Shabbat dinner, and in that moment he realized that he had been taught something that simply wasn't true. But in a conversation with Ellie Reeves, next slide, he pointed out that his father's work is ultimately to take white nationalism mainstream, that the greatest gains that the movement is attempting to make is convincing white liberals that the crime statistics and achievement gaps are undeniable evidence of black inferiority. That if you want to understand the strength of their argument for what they call fake news or political correctness, it can be found in their objection to liberals' denial about the true origins of black people's crime rates and education outcomes, which have nothing to do, they insist, with social conditions or with discrimination or with inequality. So everything I have described to you up to this point is not only dismissed as white nationalists, not as evidence of discrimination, but evidence of the inferiority of black people, from the education, from the jobs, from the health outcomes. And so here, Chris Cantwell, who was the focus of Ellie Reeves' reporting on the events of Charlottesville last summer, puts in clear relief this relationship. He described himself essentially as a libertarian, as a kind of granola kid who thought that too much government was a bad thing, but he had no particular axe to grind with black people, except that when the Trayvon Martin case happened, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and all these different things happened, every single case it seemed some little black asshole behaving like a savage, and he gets himself in trouble, shockingly enough. Whatever problems I might have with my fellow white people, they generally are not inclined to such behavior. And you have to take that into consideration when you're thinking about how to organize your society. Now, I'm not a fool, and I recognize that you could extract a little piece of his statement and hear echoes of it in the conversations on the south side of Chicago with no white people around, on the west side of Chicago with no white people around, in some fancy cafes where black gentrifiers are on the north side of Chicago, and hear the same thing. So if the issue here for Derek Black on the other side of this white nationalist movement is white liberals beware, that when you think about what it means to describe the crime in black Chicago or in Baltimore, any number of cities, if you give pause to what might be causing this crime and what is required to deal with it, you share some of the terrain that Derek Black is saying is helping white nationalism to grow in this country. But let me mix this up a little bit more, give it even a little bit more historical context. So in Boston, to take an example, in Boston, someone said, as is the case in most American communities, affairs regulate themselves very largely on a simple business basis of sale and purchase, with material means rather than race or color as the determining element. The fact that African Americans are steadily becoming better able to pay for privileges are their best guarantee of possessing these privileges. Restaurants and theaters, for instance, find that a black person's money goes as far as a white man's profits. A cab driver deems it wiser to pick up a fare from a black man than to let his vehicle stand idle. Stores of all kinds, even the most select, see no good reason for declining to sell their wares to them. Banks draw no color line, and for the right price, black people can live anywhere they choose. The bottom line, John Daniels argued, is that for those with the means to pay for privileges, they are welcomed in the marketplace of America. Those who cannot, it is a reflection of their inferiority. He said the issue of anti-black discrimination, in other words, is not race feeling, it is not color feeling, it is inferiority feeling. John Daniels was a Northern liberal with impeccable credentials. He'd worked in a settlement house in Boston for about 10 years, wrote the third most important study in 1914 called In Freedom's Birthplace, the story of Boston's black Negroes. He told many wonderful, rich stories of the traditions of abolitionism, from David Walker to Frederick Douglass, to so many others who represented the traditions, the right kind of black people who were doing the right thing. But he had a lot of negative thoughts about new migrants who had come into Boston in the late 19th century, the kind of poor black people that were struggling in parts of the city that he had spent time with up close. And so John Daniels, in some ways, offers us a much deeper sense of the tales of this story and the ways in which we remain limited in our capacity to see the real work that is in front of us, the anti-racist work that is in front of us. So we could ask ourselves, didn't the civil rights movement fix all of this? Well, of course the answer is no, but in some ways it is the story of remembrance that blinds us to what we have actually forgotten. We know the usual story, starting with, say, A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement here in Chicago. In fact, the Armory was a major site of organizing in 1940 and 1941. We know the story of black GIs, as I've alluded to, in the double victory campaign against fascism and racism at home. We know the story of the NAACP's legal fight for educational equality across the South, which eventually led to Brown versus Board of Education. We know about the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine, the Greensboro sit-in. We know about SNCCs, Ella Baker and John Lewis, Diane Nash, Bob Moses, who burst on the scene with sit-ins and freedom rides in the 1960s, of the Birmingham campaign, of the I Have a Dream speech, of LBJ's signing of the Civil Rights Act, the Selma March, the Voting Rights Act, so on and so forth. Now, if you think that was soundbite history, minimizing the complexity, the uncertainty, and the indeterminacy of what so many everyday black women, men, and children fought to achieve, sometimes together, sometimes at odds, sometimes with white allies, imagine what has been the national mythology of this history. The movement has become another verse in the song of American exceptionalism. A nation of bigots and bystanders have for 50 years congratulated itself for becoming a more perfect union, as if the politicians woke up one day and let freedom ring. Just like the enslaved stole themselves to freedom, setting in motion a movement against slavery and its eventual demise, so too did those torchbearers of democracy, along with some white radical allies. They made real the possibilities of a multiracial democracy in the 14th Amendment, the basis upon which the children of Mexican and Muslim immigrants have birthright citizenship to this very day, a right no other Western nation guarantees. So, what didn't we do right? What did we miss? So, first of all, we put too much faith in exceptional Negroes. What do I mean by that? It meant that our dependence upon black first to step into these institutions in the wake of the civil rights movement would somehow magically transform those institutions. And so I argue that the 50-year-old rules for that kind of racial advancement are obsolete. There's no more racial barrier left to break. There's no office in the land to which African Americans can ascend, from mayor to attorney general and the presidency, that will serve as a magical platform for saving black and brown people and our nation's soul from its racist past. We cannot engineer a more equitable nation simply by dressing up institutions in more shades of brown. We must confront structural racism and the values of our institutions. We also believe falsely that black capitalism, which was the term and the focus of Richard Nixon's administration after the Great Society, and which carried through for much of the remainder of the last 50 years, various versions of enterprise zones and minority business contracting from Clinton to even President Obama. This kind of trickle-down economics delivers a kind of trickle-down justice. If profit matters more than personhood, no matter what you call it, ending poverty or achieving justice or securing equity is not the goal. Wealth creation is for individuals, and that individual wealth means at best you get a kind of more economic inequality and maybe some philanthropy. We also put a lot of stock in personal responsibility. We accepted the false notion that the only thing that stood in the way of the American dream for black people was aspiration and hard work. The gospel of personal responsibility began to drown out the social gospel of Dr. King and black liberation theology that linked King and, say, the boogeyman of Jeremiah Wright or Albert Clegg of Detroit, and even Malcolm X. In the age of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, government was a Trojan horse for communism, the less the better. This form of social Darwinism revisited our time, and only this time, Black First gave it the veneer of legitimacy it had never had. The generation of Black mayors and police chiefs in these days led increasingly to new Black cities, and now proof that civil rights had been achieved, and then looked what happened to those cities. Black failure around every corner of a housing project, low-performing schools, or police stations overflowing with bad kids. Before Bill Cosby's karmic reckoning, he had initiated a call-out tour. He appeared in town hall meetings across America. He was essentially saying that Black people had failed in their civil rights legacy, that they had squandered their inheritance to drugs and violence and crime. Indeed, on Oprah Winfrey's show, Oprah asked Alvin Poussaint, who co-authored a book, From Victim to Victors, Come On People, said, "What happened after Brown?" And I quote Alvin Poussaint, the great Harvard medical psychologist or psychiatrist and researcher, said, "Black people turned to decadence." What really happened is COINTELPRO, the war on crime, the war on drugs, and mass incarceration. That the brunt of the state turned, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says to us, to criminal justice as the ultimate arbiter of the full or the price of your participation in this society. If you weren't a law-abiding citizen, if your poverty resulted in crime rates or poor performance in school, you'd get more police officers on the streets and more police officers in our schools. It turns out that the very infrastructure that Black people began to build in the freedom struggles after the civil rights movement, the kind of infrastructure that cost Fred Hampton his life right here in this city, the kind of agent provocateurs who set up listening posts to discredit African cultural schools like freedom schools, or in Pittsburgh, literally an after-school program to teach children Black history, became sites that were the targets of a national security apparatus that saw Black people being empowered with a cultural heritage to know something of themselves as a predicate for being a part of this larger society. I say to people all the time that where white nationalists feel threatened by their losing ground in this country, they ought to spend more time in museums. The very infrastructure that Black people were building on their own, it turns out, wasn't entirely obliterated. That organizations within the community, whether they were church-based, whether they were nonprofit, even today in the New York Times is beginning to shed light on their capacity to do some of the work of creating pro-social interventions in those communities that turned away from the blunt instrument of the law. And here I'm going to shout out Cure Violence, an organization of which, in full disclosure, I am a member of its advisory board. It's called CEASEFIRE here, and it puts people who have experienced the worst that America has to offer them and decided to go in and do the work of mentorship, of helping others to find alternatives that are life-giving rather than life-taking. And so we have the opportunity ourselves to make different choices about the kinds of politicians that we support, the kind of policies that we think will save the kind of people that live on the other side of that divide. Where there's a bridge too far, we've often decided for ourselves what they need and what they deserve, when in fact they've been fighting these fights on their own for far too long against the tides of indifference. Next slide. So in Charlottesville, we are reminded in this moment that ultimately the line separating the anger and frustration of these individuals is much thinner than the comfort we should take in our own sense of justice for those who are less off or less fortunate than we are. That this revolt against the resistance of Black activists to the symbols of white supremacy, to the removal, for example, of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, represents that ongoing commitment to challenging the humanity of Black people and their claims for a full seat at the table of this American project. Across the political spectrum, the riot galvanized or has galvanized good people to stand up against naked and bold displays of white supremacy and neo-Nazism. But will it galvanize those same people to reject, in the end, the systemic logic of anti-blackness, which is also anti-Latino, anti-Native, and anti-Muslim? While many white Americans admire, respect, and even love other Americans who just happen to be black or Mexican or Muslim, they have a much harder time admiring, respecting, and loving categorically African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, or Muslims, just as they love themselves. So when I see this moment, I am inspired not to look away, but to connect the dots in places that are close to home. And here, I want, next slide, to remind you that in Mount Greenwood, in the midst of a Black Lives Matter protest, to call attention to the crisis of policing in this country, which is very much about the state's response to the inequality and the discrimination that I hope we agree is not black people's fault. But maybe we don't. But if you do agree with me that it's not black people's fault, then the suggestion that our own neighbors, people who share our tax base, people here are part of the city of Chicago, as my best friend Ben Alston writes of an activist, Jedediah Brown, who nearly took his life in this city trying to save this city, had to defend himself from calls of Black Lives Matter as a terrorist hate group. That Jedediah, Ben writes, was met by raised middle fingers and jubilant howls from several hundred people massed on the streets. Someone swung a flagpole. Jedediah said an older woman called him a dumb nigger, and the cop separating them broke rank and said, "Mom, you're embarrassing me." Amid the tumult, Jedediah took a bullhorn from a fellow activist. If Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, he bellowed, then why or what are we fighting for? So Donald Trump did us a favor because he shows us how active and significant white supremacy is in this country. We needed to know it. We needed to see it. We needed to punch a hole in the mythology of post-racialism because we need to deal with it. Think about an oncologist. We don't want an oncologist telling us a lie that we don't have cancer. Donald Trump provides us that X-ray into the malignant tumor in our society. The tumor's always been there, but it's grown. We've tried to address it in ways small and large, and we've won some of those battles, but ultimately the patient is very sick. It is indeed our nation, and we have the choice, if we want to extract it once and for all. This may all sound depressing, I understand. But like cancer, we have the choice to face the facts and fight. The odds are long, the game is rigged, but that's nothing new. So let me leave you with an insight that's hard to swallow, but it's one that was presented to us just about 50 years ago. Here is Lerone Bennett, the former editor of the long-standing Ebony magazine, the Johnson & Johnson publication. He wrote in a special edited volume right after the Civil Rights Movement. Just as it ended, they put this special issue out, and guess what that special volume was called? The White Problem in America. Imagine that. He said, there is no Negro problem in America. The problem of race in America, insofar as that problem is related to packets of melanin in men's skin, is a white problem. He said it was a stroke of genius, really, for white Americans to give Negro Americans the name of their problem, thereby focusing attention on symptoms, the Negro and the Negro community, instead of causes, the white man and the white community. Now, if that's a little bit rough, feels a little dated, I'll leave it with, say, someone who's soon to be admired yet again in just a couple of months, the great Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. He published a book in 1968, written in 1967 during his last years. He shifted attention first to Chicago and the great housing battles here on Gage Park, which I just traveled through on my way from Midway Airport today. He wrote in a chapter called Racism and Backlash, he had this to say. He said, "It is time for us, keeping in mind this is after all of his accomplishments and all the ways in which we remember him as a saintly man who made sacrifices on behalf of the nation so that America could be great." He said, "It is time for us to tell each other the truth about who and what have brought the Negro to the condition of deprivation against which he struggles today. In human relations, the truth is hard to come by because most groups are deceived about themselves. Rationalization and the incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataracts that blind us to our individual and collective sins. But the day has passed," Dr. King said in 1968, "for bland euphemisms. He who lives with untruth lives in spiritual slavery. Freedom is still the bonus we receive for knowing the truth." And quoting, "As a good minister, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Thank you. So we're a little long. Okay, so we do have time for a couple of questions. Now, the first thing I'm going to get asked is, what do we do? So next slide. Here's an opportunity. Dr. King died 50 years ago come April, before he was able to realize the vision of a Poor People's March. And Reverend Barber, along with Liz Theo Harris, are leading a national movement which they have described as a moral revival. Many of you who know about Reverend Barber's work in North Carolina, he was formerly the state head of the NAACP there, says that we need to become moral defibrillators for a nation that can reclaim the legacy that Dr. King left us, not the one that has been co-opted in this country, but the one that he actually died for, the one that he was building in this city and so many others. And so this is your invitation, poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can read up, learn more, get involved. The mass mobilization that never happened will be in June of 2018. Okay, the floor is open for questions. And a microphone, raise your hand if you have one, and it will be brought to you. And there's someone circulating from the back.
Hi, thank you so very much for your insights. I really appreciate them. I would like to ask you, could you elaborate a bit more about the white nationalists' efforts to flip neoliberalism or liberals' idea of inferiority? I find that very fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. So what I know I learned from Ellie Reeves in a nearly 2-hour conversation, this is an interesting insight into it. So she was working at The Atlantic before Vice News. And she essentially was following, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, white nationalist and white supremacist hate groups. But she was particularly intrigued in the wake of Donald Trump's support, essentially, of not condemning their support for him, people like Richard Spencer or Jared Taylor, et cetera. So she started to track these folks as a journalist, as an investigative journalist. And she said that the folks at The Atlantic were saying to her, like, Ellie, why are you wasting your time on this? This is before the election. Because they were being dismissive of the realness of it. And so when I gave you the quote from John Daniels in 1914, what I'm suggesting to you is it's always been a very thin line between the idea that black people are a fundamental threat to American democracy, are not fit for full participation, to come from people who were willing to say it and live by it, and people who weren't sure. And the way in which the unsure people have translated a lot of their energy around this, I'm not talking about radicals, I'm not talking about the left, the hard left even, or people who sacrificed and gave their lives like Jack Greenberg or Viola Luozo. I mean, there are a lot of white folks, or Ann Braden in the South. This is not a condemnation of white people as a category. It is to say that the majority population has opted in or out at key moments in terms of the question of why do we have so much racism in this country, or racial disadvantage, or racial disparity? You pick whatever euphemism works for you. And John Daniels tells you that liberals have often decided that there was some moment, there's like an expiration date, like the excuse of racism is over, you're on your own. And so if he could feel with that kind of conviction in 1914, 15 years before Dr. King was born, about 20 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, and a year before Birth of a Nation premiered in big screens across the nation, then you get a sense of what Derek Black is describing. What the movement in his father's image is trying to say is, I am a regular person. When you saw those folks show up in polo shirts and khaki shorts with their tiki torches, that's the evidence of the movement, not of some kind of strange moment of unhooding, but an embrace. When you watch the Vice News segment, what they say is, we knew there were more people like us willing to come out here and stand up for what we believe in. And they were right. Now, that doesn't discount the counter-protests, most of whom were white. So there's a lot of room for good people to get in the action. But if they're not getting in the action, we have to ask the question, why not? And part of answering the question is, if the culture of poverty thesis of the 1960s forward and the personal responsibility rhetoric of the 1980s forward is still very much defining that until black people show themselves worthy of full citizenship, they can't have it. They can't go to school with my kids. They can't live in my neighborhood. It doesn't matter who the individual is. And if they get a certain kind of policing, well, that's a certain kind of policing they deserve. So he said that that's exactly the kind of people they're picking off. And I just learned, so again, this is what we're learning in real time. I'm working on a piece for The Nation to talk about this precisely because I'm compelled by it. Precisely because it fits within some historical patterns. But I learned recently that there's a person in our town in Maplewood, New Jersey, who went to the same high school as my children go to, who's married to a Jewish woman, who is come out as an avowed white nationalist. And so he's not saying, I'm some kind of monstrous person. He's saying, I'm exactly the person who grew up in a integrated community with a plurality of Jews, and a large population of upwardly mobile black folk, and this is how I feel about the situation. So when I said the alternative facts language that we think of in terms of news reporting around the election, the alternative facts for them had been, why do people keep lying about who black people really are? And of course, Derek Black, the young man, said that Charles Murray is a hero for these people. Not because Charles Murray believes that natural IQ is roughly distributed to the advantage of whites against blacks, which is what he argued in the bell curve along with Richard Herrnstein as a Harvard professor, but because he's in fact a legitimate scientist who is using empirical evidence to simply give the bad news to the rest of us. And so he wants liberals to just come to terms with what they've been denying. There are other kinds of theories that I will not take any more time because other people may have questions, which I can share if people want to continue to talk about it. Yes?
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Oh, no!
Thank you all for coming out this evening, and thank you, Khalil.